Welcome to Build Strong Habits podcast channel. This is an audio podcast, so take your eyes off the screen, sit back, relax, and listen.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into, this really fascinating social trend that seems to be popping up more and more these days. Heteropessimism. Think about that political ad with Julia Roberts, where the woman kind of like tricks her husband into thinking she voted for the male candidate when really she voted for the female one. Just gets you thinking.
Yeah, I remember that ad. It definitely felt like it was speaking to a lot of women out there. This kind of feeling of
Disillusionment.
with heterosexual relationships these days.
Like, is this just clever advertising?
Yeah.
Or is this something more? And that's what we're going to be unpacking today. So we've got women ditching dating apps left and right. Celebrities embracing being single or self-partnering. All these memoirs about the struggles of marriage. I mean, is this just a phase? Or are we seeing some kind of like fundamental shift in how women are approaching relationships with men?
Well, this whole idea of heteropessimism, it's definitely gained a lot of traction lately. The term was actually coined by Asa Saracen back in 2019, and it basically describes those feelings of regret, embarrassment, even hopelessness that some women experience, specifically in relation to heterosexual relationships.
Interesting. So it's not just about like, one bad date or a frustrating relationship here or there. It's more like a sense of disillusionment with the whole system, the whole idea of heterosexual relationships as they are now.
Yeah, exactly. It's about women questioning whether these relationships can really offer them fulfillment, equality, in the way that they want.
It's like they're looking at the current landscape of dating and relationships and thinking, is this really all there is?
Right. And so you see these trends popping up, women prioritizing friendships, self-improvement, maybe even exploring alternative relationship models altogether.
It makes me think of that whole boy sober movement. That was pretty big online for a while. A lot of women were really resonating with this idea of decentering men from their lives.
Yeah.
But you have to wonder, like, did it actually translate into real life changes? Or was it more of a, performative thing?
It's a good question. It's always tricky with online trends because it can feel like they exist in their own little bubble.
Well,
but at the same time, we can't deny the power of social media, especially when it comes to shaping conversations and potentially even influencing behavior.
for sure.
Take TikTok, for instance. It's become a space for women to be really open about their dating frustrations, to share their experiences, and even, explore different ways of approaching relationships.
Yeah, you see all sorts of stuff on there. Like even that whole trad wife trend. I feel like we should unpack that a little bit for our listeners.
Sure. So trad wife is short for traditional wife. And it basically describes this lifestyle where women embrace a more, traditional role within a heterosexual marriage. They might prioritize homemaking, child rearing, submitting to their husband's leadership.
It's interesting because it seems like a complete counter-narrative to what we usually hear about modern relationships.
Right. It definitely adds another layer to this whole heteropessimism conversation.
It's like on one hand, you have women saying, I'm done with men, I'm focusing on myself.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, you have women saying, I want a traditional marriage where my husband is the head of the household.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how these seemingly opposite trends can exist at the same time.
It is. And I think it speaks to this larger sense of women just trying to figure out what works for them in a world that often feels very confusing and contradictory.
Absolutely.
And to really understand these contemporary trends, I think it's helpful to look at the historical context because feminist debates about sexuality and relationships, they're not new. They were actually central to second wave feminism. Yeah. You had figures like Andrea Dworkin who were very critical of heterosexuality. They saw it as inherently patriarchal. And then you had others like Ellen Willis who advocated for sexual liberation within those existing structures.
So it's like we're seeing echoes of those same debates playing out today.
I think so. We're still grappling with those fundamental questions.
Right.
Can heterosexual relationships be truly equal? Can they be fulfilling for women in a society where these power imbalances still exist?
Right.
And I think those questions become even more urgent when we look at the current political and cultural climate. Like, think about the overturning of Roe v. Wade, that sent shockwaves through the country. And for a lot of women, it felt like a huge step backward in terms of, bodily autonomy, reproductive rights.
Yeah, it definitely felt like a real blow to a lot of people. And then you've got figures like Andrew Tate gaining all this notoriety with this whole aggressive masculinity thing. It's like, what's going on? It feels like a really confusing time to be a woman.
It is. It's really complicated. And the rise of figures like Tate, they promote these very traditional gender roles. And they often, well, they denigrate women. It just adds another layer of complexity to this whole conversation
Right.
because their popularity, especially among young men, it kind of suggests that there's this backlash against feminist progress, a reinforcement of those patriarchal structures we were just talking about.
Yeah, it's like all these things happening at once. You've got the political setbacks, these hyper-masculine figures gaining traction, and then this feeling that movements like Me Too,
Mm.
while incredibly important, haven't really led to the systemic change that a lot of people hoped for.
Right, and that sense of disappointment, that feeling of hitting a wall, I think that's crucial to understanding heteropessimism. It's not just about, individual men being disappointing. It's about feeling like the system itself is rigged against women.
So it leads to this exhaustion, this
Yeah.
sense of what's the point?
Yeah.
So is heteropessimism, ultimately, a pessimistic outlook on the potential for real change? Is it like saying, we've tried and it's not working, so we're checking out?
Well, there's definitely an element of that, but it's not just about giving up. I think it's also about recognizing the limitations of individual actions, within a larger system. It's about questioning whether focusing on personal choices, like opting out of dating, or embracing celibacy, can really dismantle those deeply entrenched power imbalances.
So it's like, okay, I'm going to make changes in my own life, but is that really going to change the system as a whole?
Right.
It makes me think about how some women are choosing to focus on, building strong female friendships, creating these supportive communities. Is that a form of heteropessimism, or is it something else entirely?
That's a really interesting question. On the one hand, it could be seen as a retreat from heterosexual relationships, a way of finding fulfillment and support outside of those traditional structures.
By creating their own spaces.
Exactly. But it could also be viewed as a form of resistance, a way of creating spaces where women feel empowered and valued, which could ultimately contribute to broader societal change.
So maybe heteropessimism isn't just about negativity towards men, but more about seeking alternative paths to happiness and fulfillment.
I think that's a really nuanced way to look at it. It's about acknowledging the very real challenges women face in heterosexual relationships, while simultaneously exploring different ways of connecting, relating,
Yeah.
and building community.
So maybe instead of seeing heteropessimism as just giving up, maybe it's actually a catalyst for change.
It's possible. By openly discussing these feelings of disillusionment, by challenging traditional expectations, and by exploring alternative relationship models, women might actually be paving the way for a more equitable future.
Like they're saying, okay, this isn't working, we need to find a new way.
Right. It's about recognizing the power of collective action, even if that action looks different than what we've traditionally seen.
But we can't just leave men out of this conversation, can we? I mean, this whole heteropessimism trend is by definition about relationships between men and women.
Absolutely. This isn't just a women's issue, it's a societal issue. And it requires men to be active participants in the conversation and, ultimately, in the solution.
So how do we even begin to bring men into this conversation in a way that's actually constructive? Because I can imagine some men hearing all this talk about heteropessimism and feeling like alienated or even attacked.
Yeah, I think that's a valid concern. It's definitely a delicate balance, but I think it's so important for men to understand that heteropessimism isn't about hating men. It's about expressing a deep frustration with the limitations, the inequalities that often come with heterosexual relationships.
So it's not about pointing fingers. It's about saying, hey, this isn't working for a lot of us, and we need to figure out how to do better.
Exactly. And that we includes men. It's a call for men to really examine their own behaviors, their own beliefs, and to consider how they might be contributing to these larger patterns.
So it's about inviting men to be part of the solution,
Yeah.
not making them the enemy.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that men also have a stake in creating more equitable, more fulfilling relationships. After all, everyone benefits from a society where women feel empowered and respected.
Right. It's not a zero-sum game.
Yes.
So, okay. How can men be better allies in this conversation? What does that look like, practically speaking?
I think it starts with listening, really listening to women's experiences and perspectives without getting defensive or dismissive.
Just trying to understand where they're coming from.
Right. It's about acknowledging the very real challenges women face, even if those challenges don't align with their own personal experiences.
So it's about empathy, understanding, putting yourself in someone else's shoes, even if those shoes feel uncomfortable.
Exactly. And it's also about being willing to challenge those traditional notions of masculinity, because those rigid gender roles and expectations, they can be harmful to everyone, not just women.
It makes me think about those messages that boys often get. Man up, don't cry, be tough. It's like they're being told to suppress their emotions, to be stoic.
And when men are discouraged from expressing vulnerability or seeking emotional support, it can create real barriers to intimacy and connection.
And it can also lead to those unhealthy coping mechanisms, like aggression
Mhm.
or emotional withdrawal.
Exactly.
So this conversation about heteropessimism, it becomes a conversation about redefining masculinity, about creating space for men to be more emotionally open, more expressive.
I think that's a really insightful way to put it. It's about moving beyond those simplistic narratives of men are bad
Right.
or women are victims and recognizing the shared humanity that connects us all.
It's interesting how we started this whole deep dive talking about a political ad,
Yeah.
and now we're having this much broader conversation about gender roles,
Oh,
communication, the future of relationships. It really shows how even those seemingly small cultural moments can spark these really important conversations.
absolutely. And it's a reminder that these conversations need to happen on multiple levels, within ourselves, within our relationships, and within society as a whole.
So for our listeners out there who might be feeling all these complex emotions around heteropessimism, what would you say to them? What's the key takeaway here?
I would say it's okay to feel disillusioned, frustrated, even angry. Your feelings are valid, but don't let those feelings lead you to despair. Use them as fuel for growth, for change, for creating the kinds of relationships and communities that feel authentic and fulfilling to you.
I love that. Use those feelings as fuel. And remember, this is a conversation that's still unfolding. There's no easy answer, no one-size-fits-all solution. It's about staying curious, staying engaged,
Yeah.
and staying open to new possibilities.
Exactly. And remember, you're not alone in this. There are so many others out there grappling with these same questions, seeking connection, working toward a more equitable future.
Well, that's a hopeful note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into heteropessimism. It's been a fascinating conversation.
It's been my pleasure.
Until next time, keep diving deep, keep those conversations going, and keep questioning everything.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Build Strong Habits.